Surf culture in California didn't just wash ashore one day, it slowly rolled in, building over decades like a perfect swell, carrying with it waves of style, rebellion, creativity, and an unmistakable sense of freedom that would come to define a major part of the California identity. Though the roots of surfing stretch deep into Polynesian history, where wave riding was not just sport, but spiritual expression, it was along the Golden Coast of California, particularly from the 1960s through the 1990s, that the culture took on a life of its own and was reinvented in a distinctly American form. What had once been a relatively small, tight-knit community of ocean-obsessed thrill-seekers gradually grew into something much bigger, a full-blown lifestyle that shaped music, film, fashion, language, and even the national imagination. Surfing in California wasn't simply about catching waves, it was about chasing a feeling. Freedom, adrenaline, solitude, rebellion, whatever the rider needed it to be. By the early 1960s, the beach had become more than just a sun-drenched place to get a tan or a date. It was a kind of sanctuary, a launch pad for identity. Surfing exploded into the American mainstream with the help of Hollywood and pop music. Films like Gidget and The Endless Summer romanticized the lifestyle, painting surfers as sunburnt dreamers chasing the horizon and living outside the confines of regular society. At the same time, the sounds of the Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, and other surf rock pioneers turned suburban garages into rehearsal spaces for kids who had never even seen the ocean. Suddenly, anyone with a radio and a bucket of hair bleach could tap into the California fantasy. The imagery was so strong it became iconic. Blonde hair tousled by salt water, bronze skin kissed by the sun, beat-up woodies with wax boards strapped to the roof, bare feet leaving prints in hot sand. This was the dream being sold by Hollywood, and the world eagerly bought in. Kids from Ohio to Okinawa, from Toronto to Tokyo, wanted to be Californians, or at the very least, they wanted to dress and act like them. The surfboard wasn't just a tool. It became a symbol, a passport to a freer, wilder way of life. But surfing, despite its polished cinematic presentation, wasn't just carefree sunshine and top 40 sing-alongs. It held a deeper meaning, especially for those who lived it day after day. It wasn't just about the waves. It was about what the waves stood for. To drop in on a perfect right-hander wasn't just about balance and timing. It was about dropping out of the carefully regimented post-war American dream. It was an act of personal liberation, a kind of rejection of the 9-to-5, white picket fence lifestyle that many young people were starting to question. While much of the country was heading into offices, getting haircuts, and following the script laid out for them, surfers were slipping into neoprene, paddling out before dawn, and living by the rhythm of the ocean. The 1960s were already a decade on fire, with civil rights movements, anti-war protests, and counterculture revolutions reshaping the country's consciousness. In many ways, surfers were ahead of that curve. Long before phrases like drop out and tune in hit the mainstream, surfers were already living an alternate reality. Barefoot, shaggy-haired, and fiercely independent, they were tuning out the expectations of society in favor of the next set. Surf culture on land thrived on a similar ethos. It was casual, creative, irreverent, and often subversive. There were unspoken codes in the water, of course. Respect for the lineup, for locals, for the break. But beyond the beach, everything else felt wide open. The culture rejected formality and embraced spontaneity. It was the anti-suit, the anti-desk, the anti-schedule, and very much the anti-anything that wasn't fun. As the 1970s rolled in, surf culture began to mellow out, just slightly, easing off the intense energy of the 60s without losing its soul. The scene didn't shrink, it just shifted. Boards evolved, becoming shorter, sleeker, and more maneuverable. Gone were the heavy, long boards of the Gidget era. In their place came faster, more responsive shapes that allowed for sharper turns and more aggressive riding. The evolution of the board matched the evolution of the attitude. Surfers, once seen as mellow beach bums, started picking up a harder edge. The punk rock movement was bubbling up just inland, and by the mid-70s, its influence had drifted west, carried by word of mouth, surf mags, and cassette tapes passed around like sacred artifacts. The collision between surfing and skating was inevitable and explosive. What started in the pools and back alleys of Southern California quickly merged with the beachside vibe. Surfer dudes and skaters weren't just existing in parallel, they were blending, bleeding into each other's scenes. often quite literally, with scabbed knees and rolled ankles to prove it. You could walk down a Venice alley and see a kid with salt-stiff hair, OP board shorts hanging low, blasting the Ramones or the Dead Kennedys from a battered boombox, sunburned and dazed after an early morning session. This was a culture that thrived on friction between land and sea, rebellion and routine, chill and chaos. Southern California was the epicenter of this fusion, particularly hot spots like Venice Beach and Huntington Beach. These weren't just surf towns. They were incubators of a new kind of youth culture. You had surfboards and skateboards stored in the same garages, punk flyers taped next to tide charts, and parties where the scent of salt water mixed with sweat and spray paint. Surf magazines like Surfer, Surfing, and Breakout became sacred texts. Each issue was devoured, not just for the action shots and gear reviews, but for the stories, the lifestyle, the language. And behind closed garage doors and under stilted beach houses, backyard-shaping bays, cranked-out custom boards that would go on to shape more than just waves. They'd shape legacies. Groms, young, scrappy, fearless kids, got their start here, carving out lines both literal and metaphorical on their way to becoming icons. By the time the 1990s rolled around, California surf culture had morphed into something far larger than its sandy origins. It was no longer confined to beach towns or coastal communities. It had become a worldwide export, a carefully cultivated image that reached well beyond the breaks of Huntington Beach or the long rides at Malibu. The aesthetic, sun-bleached hair, bronze skin, salt-washed board shorts, and a casual, almost indifferent attitude was replicated, repackaged, and spread across every form of media. And during the 1990s, with a rapidly growing appetite for cable television, music videos, and teen-focused advertising, this version of California surf life wasn't just preserved. It was amplified to near mythical proportions. Suddenly, you didn't have to live anywhere near an ocean to adopt the vibe. You didn't even have to know how to swim. Teenagers in landlocked states like Kansas or in cities halfway across the world like Tokyo or Manchester started dressing the part. They wore Quiksilver board shorts, even if they'd never seen a wave, rocked Volcom t-shirts with surf logos they didn't fully understand, and looped puka shell necklaces around their necks as if they'd been beachcombing that morning. The wardrobe became a passport into a fantasy lifestyle, one that didn't require sand under your feet, just the right branding on your back. The surf gear of the 90s wasn't just functional attire for wave chasing. It had become an aesthetic choice, a badge of effortlessness and attitude, and the retail world caught on fast. Chains like Pacific Sunwear, better known as PacSun, brought the beach to the malls. Storefronts and suburban shopping centers across America were transformed into SoCal outposts, with racks of graphic tees, sandals, and board shorts designed not for water, but for walking the food court. The whole setup let teenagers buy into a lifestyle that promised escape, attitude, and just the right amount of rebellion. Television played a massive role in embedding this version of California surf culture into the collective imagination. The most famous and influential example was undoubtedly Baywatch, which became a global sensation. The show wasn't just about lifeguards patrolling the beaches of L.A., it was a weekly broadcast of what California was supposed to look and feel like. Beautiful, tanned people running in slow motion along the shoreline, surfboards in the background, sunset lifeguard towers. It packaged surf culture into something glossy, exaggerated, and endlessly appealing. It was part soap opera, part beach fantasy, and all spectacle. Even though surfing wasn't the central focus, the presence of the ocean and surf aesthetics was constant. Beach bonfires, casual wave riding, and that carefree attitude that surf culture sold so well. It didn't matter whether or not the storylines were believable. What mattered was the vibe, and the vibe was pure West Coast dream. And then there was California Dreams, a teen sitcom that aired on Saturday mornings and was practically a time capsule of early 90s surf teen life. The characters played in a band, hung out after school, and lived what looked like the most laid-back life possible, with beach scenes often used as a backdrop. Surfboards leaned against walls, ocean breezes blew through their dialogue, and everything was soaked in golden hour sunlight. The idea that everyone in California surfed, played guitar, and fell in love in the sand was baked into the plot. Even when the show ventured into typical high school drama, the surfside aesthetic never faded. It was baked into the dialogue, the costumes, and the set design. The realism didn't matter. The power was in the illusion. And for kids watching across the country, that illusion was captivating. Hollywood didn't just flirt with surf culture in the 1990s. It dove in headfirst, sun-bleached and saltwater drenched. Movies of the decade used the beach and the break as more than just settings. They turned surfing into a symbol, a stand-in for everything from spiritual freedom to moral conflict. Point Break from 1991 wasn't just a surf movie, it was the surf movie. Directed by Kathryn Bigelow, it elevated the genre by giving it stakes, style, and a serious existential undercurrent. Keanu Reeves played Johnny Utah, an ex-college quarterback turned rookie FBI agent, sent deep undercover into a Southern California surf gang suspected of robbing banks. Patrick Swayze played Bodie, the gang's leader, a charismatic, philosophical adrenaline junkie who saw surfing not just as a sport, but as a way of life, a path to enlightenment, and an act of rebellion against the soul-deadening grind of modern life. The film was drenched in mist. The ocean wasn't just scenery, it was an untamable force that mirrored the characters' internal chaos. The waves in Point Break became metaphors for addiction, escape, violence, and even death. Surfing was framed as both salvation and self-destruction. And by the end of the film, it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. Bodie's final ride into the impossible wave isn't just about avoiding capture. It's about surrendering to something bigger than himself. It's martyrdom by surfboard. A decade later, Blue Crush would arrive with a sleeker, more female-forward take on surf life, but Point Break remained the cultural lightning bolt of the genre, pure 90s adrenaline wrapped in neoprene and pseudo-zen. Even children's movies and cartoons couldn't resist the gravitational pull of surf culture. Films like Surf Ninjas leaned into the absurd, mashing martial arts, tropical settings, and board-riding heroics into a kid-friendly fantasy that made surfboards seem like secret weapons. Meanwhile, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, already drenched in pizza-fueled California slang, absorbed surfer lingo wholesale. Phrases like cowabunga, gnarly, and totally tubular became catchphrases not just for the turtles, but for an entire generation of kids mimicking what they thought West Coast surf life sounded like. This wasn't parody, it was cultural saturation. These movies and shows didn't mock surf culture. They helped mainstream it, even when they exaggerated it for laughs. The music of the era was just as drenched in beach air and youthful chaos. While earlier decades had the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean harmonizing about woodies and waves, the 1990s brought grit and grit pop. The sound of surf culture changed with the times. Fewer harmonies, more distortion. Bands like Sublime captured the messy, lived-in reality of coastal life with songs that fused reggae rhythms, punk energy, and hip-hop swagger. Their 1992 debut album, 40 Ounces to Freedom, wasn't technically a surf album, but it felt like it. Listening to it was like riding shotgun in a beat-up car, cruising down PCH with the windows down, the scent of salt, smoke, and spilled beer in the air. It was raw and imperfect, but honest. Tracks like Bad Fish and Date Rape weren't polished pop. They were snapshots of beachside boredom, rebellion, and low-level chaos. The Red Hot Chili Peppers, in their early 90s incarnation, played a similar game, merging funk, punk, and poetic madness into a sound that matched California's unpredictable rhythm. Their songs weren't always about surfing, but they felt like surfing, unpredictable, sweaty, and soaked in sunlight. As the decade moved forward, punk and ska took over the youth soundscape. Bands like The Offspring, Rancid, and Blink-182 emerged with a different but complementary energy. These groups captured the essence of suburban restlessness and teenage angst, packaging it into short, fast, catchy bursts of frustration and longing. Their music videos often featured skate parks, beach parking lots, and yes, surfboards slung under arms or strapped to car roofs. Even if surfing wasn't the subject, the aesthetic loomed large, carefree, rebellious, and unfiltered. Even fashion followed the tide, flowing effortlessly into the mainstream, with surf brands leading the charge. Stussy, Rusty, Billabong, and Gotcha weren't just companies pushing clothes and accessories, they were badges of identity. Wearing one of their logos signaled more than just a taste in style. It was a lifestyle declaration, a way of aligning yourself with an entire subculture, even if you'd never paddled out past the breakers. A Quiksilver wallet peeking out of your cargo shorts, or a Rip Curl sticker slapped onto the cover of your school binder wasn't just decoration, it was a quiet claim to credibility. It said, I get it, I'm part of this, even if your version of this existed entirely inland. This was the height of what could only be called surfcore, a marketing wave that swept across continents and demographics, washing surf culture into the closets of people who had never touched salt water. Suddenly, the aesthetic of wave riding, a loose tank top, faded board shorts, sandy vans, sun-bleached hair, was accessible to anyone with a shopping mall nearby. Riding the wave itself wasn't a requirement anymore. Looking like you might at any given moment was good enough. Retail stores from coast to coast carried the uniform, making the culture feel universal, even generic at times. And for many people, especially young suburban kids, the closest they ever got to the ocean was the airbrushed stock photo on a wetsuit tag. But it didn't matter. The power of the imagery, the music, the mood, all of it combined to deliver a fully packaged sense of escape. You didn't need the Pacific Ocean. You just needed the idea of it. California's surf culture had completed its mission in the broader cultural imagination. It had successfully transformed itself from a niche sport into a global language of rebellion, freedom, and endless summer. It was aspirational, romantic, and just dangerous enough to make it appealing to the masses. The tan lines, the wave graphics, the laid-back poses, they all told the same story. Life was better where the tide met the sand, and you could be part of it just by dressing the part. Ironically, though, the sheer popularity of this media-fueled version of surf life meant that the actual surfing community, the real surfers who lived for dawn patrols, who knew which breaks to avoid on a crowded weekend, who waxed their boards in silence before hitting the cold Pacific, were often edited out of the narrative entirely. The everyday reality of the surf lifestyle wasn't glamorous. It meant shivering through foggy mornings, waiting for the right swell, dealing with territorial locals, and spending more time wiping out than standing up. But that rawness didn't translate well to TV shows or magazine spreads. Instead, surf culture became a mood board, something that could be imitated, commodified, and remixed to suit whatever image sold best. Even today, decades after that golden era, the fingerprints of 90s surf culture are still everywhere. You can see it in the resurgence of vintage surf posters, in the lo-fi surf rock playlists that score TikToks and indie films, in fashion lines that pull from old OP designs and slap washed-out palm trees on their branding. Surf lingo still slips into everyday speech, and beach aesthetics continue to sell everything from sneakers to soda. The influence never really went away. It just morphed, adapted, and found new shores. From the sun-kissed shores of the Gold Coast in Australia to the rough, windswept, and rainy surf of Padstow and Bude in Britain's Devon and Cornwall, each of these communities, large and small, owe their existence and their aesthetic to the classic original from the good old US of A. California surf culture didn't disappear. It didn't get swallowed by time or watered down beyond recognition. It simply did what surfers always do after a long ride. It caught its breath, waxed up the board, and paddled right back out into the lineup, waiting for the next perfect wave.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 19 on X, we're here just for you, for you.